David breathed in deeply, his body shaking with the effort. He stared down at his hands, which were still matted with John's blood and hair. He'd held him by the head because that was all he could get a grip on. Bits of skin and flesh hung to the base of the follicles, where they'd been wrenched from John's skull when he'd been pulled away. Blood dripped from the massive gashes in David's forearms, where he'd hit the side of the boat. He'd hit it hard, and rather than cutting his arms, they'd essentially been split open by the impact. They burned with pain as a soft breeze rolled over the water. Something splashed and David's eyes shot up from his hands, and he screamed. He screamed so violently it felt as though his lungs were bagpipes being squeezed of every bit of air they held within them. The scream tore through the silence of the lake and sent a few ducks to his left near the shore into flight away from him. He screamed until he was out of breath, then sat there mouth wide open, staring at the water. It was all just as still as it had been before they'd hooked into that trout. It was a massive one for such a small lake, at least 20 inches, probably around 3 to 5 pounds, depending on how well it had been feeding. David had fought the thing on the cheap combo rod they had bought at Walmart that morning. The tag on it had said it was spooled with 6-pound line, so he'd let it run itself tired before reeling it into the boat. They had forgotten the net back in the truck. David's line would have snapped if he tried to lift it. John had leaned down over the side of the boat to grab the trout by the gills and hoist it in. As John leaned in for the trout, the boat shook violently. David wasn't sure if the boat had rocked because of something John did, or if it had been the fish. He prayed for his sake. It wasn't the fish. John fell into the water then. Water splashed up like he'd purposely done a cannonball, not accidentally fallen overboard. The line snapped and David fell hard on his ass. He'd started to laugh watching John grab at the edge of the boat. The boat they'd rented had been a cheap, old-fashioned aluminum John boat. A John boat for John, was the joke the salesman had said, with a real smile on his face that morning. Being aluminum and cheap meant it wasn't well balanced in the slightest. They'd slipped several times just standing on it while they fished. Now as John grabbed at the edge, the boat rocked back and forth with his awkward weight. Every time he pulled on it, he nearly sank the side into the lake. When he was done laughing, David grabbed the side of the boat he was on and stretched his hand out for John. If he pulled on the opposite side, while John climbed in, he figured it hopefully wouldn't topple over. The boat hadn't toppled over. It had been worse. As John was reaching for David's hand, something had sucked him backwards. David watched as John was reaching upwards, then the water around him started flowing backwards. It flowed and jerked John down. His fingertips held onto the edge of the boat, and the whole thing rocked so violently in that moment, David was sure it would capsize. But it didn't. For a moment the water stopped rushing, and the boat fell back onto its belly, slamming David's back against the edge behind him. Water splashed over the sides of the boat, soaking David, but not sinking the thing. John screamed as the water started to rush again, and pulled himself forward as hard as he could. David lunged from his sitting position, grabbing for John's hands, but overshot and grabbed his head. Then the suction reached a peak, and John was ripped from the side of the boat below the water. He'd looked into David's eyes in that final moment. David had seen the fear, the panic, and the anguish. He'd also seen something else, just as John had disappeared. Below him there was a mouth, wide open, waiting for him to arrive. Huge whiskers came off the side of the top lip, and the flow of the water beneath them into the gaping hole of a mouth made them dance. He'd seen its eyes, too, dark black pools that seemed to stare up at him, while John's face disappeared into the darkness. David fell forward with the force of the pull and slammed his arms into the side of the boat, cracking open the flesh and leaving large smears of blood along the edges. The boat rocked hard forward, letting some water over the edge, but swayed back just as violently, preventing it from capsizing. As it swung back, David saw John's bright orange shirt just below the surface of the water. Then he was gone. The water made a heavy slurp noise and lay still. Whatever massive catfish or other thing that was down there had taken John. The boat rocked side to side, but eventually found equilibrium and floated there, with David staring at his hands. David's lungs burned. He'd screamed out every bit of air he'd had in him. Now his breaths came in large rasps as his lungs tried to catch up with what they'd lost. Deep breath in that felt as though the inside of his throat had been attacked by some pissed-off cat. He could feel the individual cracks and scratches he'd made. Then deep exhale, the moisture of his lungs bringing a small relief to the cracks. Then he'd inhale again, and the cycle continued. He sat like this for what must have been at least an hour. It wasn't until the sheen of purple and pink started over the lake with sunset. It wasn't until the sheen of purple and pink started overtaking the lake with sunset before he moved. David stood, and the boat gently rocked with his motion. His breath was now coming in normal volumes, but his throat was so dry no exhale could bring any kind of relief. The blood was still dried and crusted to his hands. Little bits of hair still clung to some of it. He looked over to the lake water. When you go to fish, you usually rinse off by reaching down over the edge of the boat. He wouldn't be touching the water. He wiped his hands on his shorts aggressively to get the blood off. He walked to the back of the boat slowly, doing his best not to make any commotion on the water. The boat still rocked gingerly and sent ripples out that dissipated quickly. His boots still made a clunking sound as he stepped. He'd read in a fishing magazine near the Walmart tackle department that fish could feel the vibrations of someone walking on the shore. He hoped it was just bass or trout that could do it. He sat down on a small bench at the back and rested his arm on the engine of the boat. The black paint shined at him with the promise of escape. He stared at the engine, debating whether he could trust that promise. If that thing heard him start it up, how long would it take it to be on him? Would it be attracted to that kind of sound in the first place? What other choice did he have? It wasn't like there was anything to row the boat with, and fuck swimming. That only left the motor, with its shining promise of speed and escape. Slowly he drifted his hand from the front of it to the handle of the pull cord. One more deep breath. One more slow standing motion as he turned his body towards it for proper pulling leverage. He yanked as hard as he could on the thing, and the engine shot to life. The loud sounds of burning gasoline broke the silence of the lake and started shaking the boat. He sat down hard and fast, grabbing the steering rod and turning it aggressively so that the nose of the boat was pointed at the nearest shoreline. It wasn't the one they'd landed on, but fuck it, he could walk around the lake. Water shot out from behind him and arced as he turned the boat. In the middle of the turn, he could see out over the entire lake. He saw it, a shadow under the water close to him. How close he didn't know, but it was close. He started forward, accelerating the boat, focusing on the thin stretch of shoreline he was quickly approaching. He could hear the splash of water as the boat sprayed in every direction. The hand holding the steering rod went numb as he squeezed it as hard as he could. His leg screamed in pain as his other hand did the same to his thigh. His teeth were clenched and his jaw tight as the small strip of land got bigger. There was a splash behind him, but he couldn't turn to look. He only leaned forward, as if that would somehow make the boat go faster. The shore was coming quick, and he couldn't be more than 20 feet away from it when something hit the engine. The blades of the bottom of the boat jammed into what he could only assume was catfish flesh, and the engine sputtered and died. Although the boat did not. It zipped across the top of the water the last 20 feet with no engine to push it, slamming into the rocky shore and stopping abruptly as its nose got buried in the dirt and the whole thing did a wicked headstand, sending David careening into the ground. He landed hard. His face slammed into the gravel. Rocks embedded themselves into his cheeks and forehead, where the flesh hit the hardest. His body came down below him, hitting just as hard, and knocking the wind out of his lungs into the dirt below the rocks, puffing it into his face as his legs fell. He turned over onto his back and could feel the blood flow from somewhere on the front of his head. It was warm as it streamed down his forehead, over the bridge of his nose, and off his cheek. He lay there gasping desperately, the dust from the dirt filling his mouth as he tried to regain his breath. When he eventually did, it came as one of the biggest reliefs of his life, and he managed to raise himself up onto his hands. Sitting on his ass and leaning on his arms behind him, he looked over to the boat that had toppled forwards after launching him, then rolled onto its side. Then something caught his eye just past it. In the final lights of day, when night will soon take over the sky, but the sun has just a few minutes to show people what was out there. He saw a glint of an eye reflecting the light from the water. It wasn't a shiny yellow or green like a cat or a coyote. No, it was a shine that reminded him of the black paint of the engine. a spot that shone and yet was darker than the water around it. It looked at him knowingly and dove beneath the water. This has been A Fishing Trip, written and narrated by Grayska Voice. Like and subscribe for more.